In our study of the synthesis of yoga, we are fast approaching the end of the chapter titled The Planes of Our Existence. Here, Sri Aurobindo has defined what makes for a world or a plane of consciousness based on the relationship between the Purusha and Prakriti, nature, the observing soul consciousness and the energy of expression. There are many relationships possible between these two, and each of these relationships, when fully developed and expressed, is a world in itself. We have so far been in some detail in the nature of the physical world, and the relationship of Purusha and Prakriti is so tightly bound that one feels as if one is a product of the material processes and does not have any separate existence. Unlike the physical world, in the vital world, the relationship is one of energies, and all is expression of energy and flow of energy. Between these two worlds, there was a detailed description of the relationship of how the physical world is as if a special projection of the vital world, and between the physical and the vital there is a continuous flow down from the vital to the physical and back from the physical to the vital, and there are beings of the vital which have their own domains in the vital world, which is so much more plastic, worlds within the world of the vital, and from there some have their pressure of action or influence on the physical world. Subsequently, Sri Aurobindo spent a good deal of discussion on why we are unaware of all this, so much more of the vital and other planes which are pressing upon the physical world, pressing upon us individually, and even act between us and others. And the explanation he gave was that we are normally bound only in the physical senses, and these connections are not seen through physical senses. Equally, we live much more in the outermost physical part of the body and the physical vitality and physical mind, and these connections are through our vital body and our mental body, of which we are normally entirely unconscious. By self-development, he says, we can become aware of them, possess our life in them, get through them into conscious relation with the life world and other worlds, and use them also for a more subtle experience and more intimate knowledge of the truths, facts and happenings of even the material world itself. We can, by this self-development, live more or less fully on planes of our existence other than the material, which is now all in all to us. This really opens us to a huge possibility of development which is still waiting for us. And none of this yet involves a spiritual development, as we saw. It's only a question of self-development and not spiritual development. Being as we are, by developing certain deeper and subtler skills of awareness, we can become conscious of these bodies and then become conscious in these bodies and then begin to perceive and act through these bodies. Literally then, we will be living in three different domains, or at least aware of three different domains in which we would be simultaneously conscious, but also conscious of a complex interrelation between these domains. If upon this we can add a spiritual development, that would open us to that which transcends these three and which can, penetrating these three, completely transform them. First of all, liberate them from their limitations, and then awaken in them the experience of the truth consciousness, of the consciousness of the self and the soul, and the freedom that they bring in, the true freedom, that they bring in. But before he moves on to the description of the spiritual and the supra-mental domains, we have still to explore the in-between, which is the domain of mind. And this is a paragraph which we have explored already quickly. We went through it to get an overall sense of the gist of it, and of which we will now take an approach in some more detail. There will be elements which we may repeat, but for purpose of elaboration. And we will also draw on some of Mother's conversations with the students, as well as some of Sri Aurobindo's letters, as we explore this. First of all, he says, beyond the life world is a mental plane, a world of mental existence in which neither life nor matter, but mind is the first determinant. Mind there is not determined by material conditions or by the life force, but itself determines and uses them for its own satisfaction. So we have to now conceive of a domain where matter does not exist, life energy does not exist, and there is only mental awareness. As an exercise last time, I had suggested what happens when you close your eyes and completely ignore all your physical senses, and you're aware that you're aware. And that awareness is your first point of contact with the pure mental consciousness. But it's not actually the pure mind. It is the part of the mind which is largely embedded in the physical. It is what he has earlier referred to as the physical mind here. In this consciousness, you at least have a sense of awareness. We saw also how in this awareness, the sense of directions have no meaning. The sense of forward and backward also has no meaning. We made this is something we have yet to do. We made a similar exercise with the vital consciousness. If you are purely aware of the energy of your consciousness and ignore anything to do with materiality, all energy passing right through you, the sense of forward and backward does not have the same sense as a physical direction. Energetically, forward is what you're going towards in terms of action and intention, and back is what you're leaving behind. Side is what accompanies you and moves with you in alignment. And so the experience in the vital body of direction is very different. But in the mental consciousness, if we applied a similar exercise, we would discover interesting things also. What for your pure mind is forward, and what for your pure mind is behind? Think about this for a moment. If you're purely aware as a mental awareness, no sense of directions, nothing of the physical world exists, and then you say in your mind, I want to move ahead. What's the sense of ahead? And here the sense is purely one of the future. It's the sense of movement forward in time. And the sense of behind is the sense of what you have left back in the past. Contrast this with the vital energy. When it thinks or when it feels the flow forward, it is more an action being done towards a certain outcome. It's not in a sense of time, but in terms of a sense of action, of change, of production. And what you leave behind is the thing which has to do with either what pulls you back energetically, what delays, or what is heavy, or what now breaks down. A similar thing happens in mind, but the quality is totally different. It is of the conceptual awareness now thinking ahead, and it's a movement as if forward in time to create, to form, but not energetically in idea. So when in your consciousness you look at the future and say, I am going to do this, and you begin to think about it and organize it, this is largely a mental exercise. When into this you add your vital force, I must do it. I have to direct my energies. You gather your full force for an outcome. That is aligning the vital to the mental idea. And then when you translate that finally into physical action, you start taking steps and movements and actions, then you're aligning the physical. But there are three very distinct operations on three very distinct levels. When all three are aligned, then you have the successful outcome. If you eliminate even one of these, you will not have the outcome. If you eliminate, for example, the physical action, you can put an idea, you can put a strong energy for it, but nothing happens until you move. Of course, the idea and energy you put out might catch somebody else and work through them, but still it needs a physical action to finally end up in a physical result. Otherwise, you've only created a formation which either depends on instruments or eventually fizzles out of its own. Similarly, if you remove the vital and you have a clear mental idea, but now you try to actualize it, but without the dynamism and the push and the enthusiasm of energy, you can do the work very quietly, perhaps even succeed in completing it, but it will be a very simple, bare, minimal outcome. When there is a strong vital energy pouring, it will tend to aggrandize, dramatize, make large, spread it out, which is typically the characteristic of the vital. In most of the utopian ideas that we have, let's make this perfect, let's make it ideal, without the vital element aligned to it, you will make small little patches of that perfection, and they hardly last or they hardly have a strong impact on the environment around them. So the vital engagement with the clarity of the mind, and ideally with this spiritual energy, would make for the dramatic outcome which impacts in a larger space. Similarly, without that mental domain, you can have a strong vital push and a very strong physical activity, but the outcome may often be chaotic, or it may be haphazard because not guided by the clarity of the mind. Now, all three in us need to be developed separately to begin with, and then integrated and aligned so that they can work together as one. There are many people in whom there is a great sattvic quality in thought. They can often act with great precision, but they lack a strong vital, which is often the character of the the sattvic person. He does not have too much of the problem of strong desires, rajasic pulls and pushes. On the other hand, the outcome is also not very strong and effective. Equally, there are people who have strong vitals, very rajasic, often trapped by their own desire impulses, and for them it's difficult to hold the purity of the conception without mixing elements of their own push. Again, to take an example of a person in the context of Auroville, when Mother was formulating the details of the Matrimandir, she had, of course, the architect whom she declared as my architect, Roger Anger, for Auroville, for the Matrimandir. But when it came to the inner chamber, she said, I will not speak to the architect. I will only speak to the engineer. And she called the engineer and explained with precision, numerical precision also, exactly how things had to be. And I think she makes a comment about it, or she hints on it, that architects tend to add something of their own fancy. And where she wanted exactly what she wants, she stayed with the engineer, who are trained to act with precision within what they know and not add their own fancy there. But this is an element of the vital. The moment it catches an idea, it needs to add its own drama and its own fancy. So to train each of these is often a lifetime work. And then to integrate them, to train the vital to actually accept the mind's clarity and not add its own fancy, is again a lifetime's work. And then to integrate that with the physical, to make the body, in a sense, strong enough to accept the drive of the vital and the clarity of the mind, and to be able to persist without having physical weaknesses and inertia and other issues which are typical, the tamas, which is the typical problem of the physical body, is again a whole training. And there you are often dependent on a good heredity, or at least a proper physical training program to lift it out of any defective inheritances. So all this integration and building just to make you an effective instrument. And we have not yet touched the integration or the awakening of the soul's influence and its integration, or opening to the spiritual influence and its integration, which is when the spiritual life proper begins. These three developed is a very big achievement for humanity, and it is what would make us different from a thinking ape. If you think about it, Sri Aurobindo makes this observation in his writings on education, that without the psychic element, man is nothing but a thinking animal. The characteristic of the vital, especially when it's not very refined, is really no different from the ape, and the body and the vital together. Throw upon that an active intelligence and you have a thinking animal. What does it do? It uses its intelligence to satisfy its animal passions and desires and priorities. Until the vital and the physical are brought under guidance of the mind, and the mind itself turns to its own higher ideals and not turns to serve the lower desires, you don't have a proper human being even. And even when you have that, a proper human being, now thinking and his vital leading, his vital following his mind, you have the highly refined, civilized thinking animal. You still have not the higher turn of the human, which comes with the psychic influence that says, yes, but my life must have a deeper meaning or purpose. And it's only with the influence of the psychic then one feels the turn even to build, to create, conceive of beautiful ideas, or for the vital to manifest a certain beauty and harmony in its possibilities. Take, for example, the skilled modern art, and often with great skill, often with strong mental elements or vital elements and even physical skills, it may not have anything of the soul's influence. And for all practical purposes, it lasts for a while and then it fades out. But just a little bit of the soul influence, and you have something extraordinary that will last centuries. But it's difficult to define what made for that special something. I've mentioned before also the example of the Russian gymnasts who had come to the ashram in the 1950s. And they performed extraordinary feats which today you can see easily on television or on the internet. People with great skill doing extraordinary things. And then mother's comment after that was, if they had just a little bit of the spirituality, they would have been like the gods. But a skill taken very high, and it stops there. To what purpose does it serve? Because the mind fully developed, leading the vital and the physical, can hold itself on an ideal, and the mental ideal will be, let's all work in harmony, let's all have equally the best, and so on. But for what? And there is still no sense of a deeper purpose, which comes from the psychic and from the spiritual, which says, for the divine. Because it senses, it knows that there is this divine possibility. And when you turn for the divine, the whole thing lifts up. And the possibilities of the divine coming into it lifts beyond the animal, beyond even the human, and gives to it the whole point of evolution. But all of this, as I said, is many lives worth of work. It cannot be done in a single life. And that's why all of us here have to recognize that we have been through this work before. We have developed these things in earlier, even civilizational cycles. Perhaps most of us were present during the time, let's say in Greece, where there was a special turn for a kind of an intellectual development. Or in a certain part of Europe, when the attempt to develop that intellectual possibility to apply it into society was the primary focus. Or at a certain stage in India, when the movement of the bhakti of the heart was to be developed to refine the vital and turn it towards the divine. And each of these spaces became focal points for a special development, and all the souls which had to participate for that development took the opportunity over a span of a couple of centuries perhaps to develop those things. But this life where we are at today is often, and for most of us, a life of integration of all this. And especially not just integration in themselves, but integration around the soul's aspiration. Because each of these things developed in itself, even each of these things related to the soul, as in the movement of bhakti, is not enough. The whole together has to be integrated as one around the soul. And so I've kind of digressed from what we are reading, but it was to highlight the fact that there are these three operations, these three levels through which we act. But they have to be fully integrated around the center, and this life is primarily for this purpose. It is with this that the true spiritual turn and the process and direction of transformation begins. Through this, when we begin to align to the soul, which then leads with its spiritual values and recasts these three bodies and the full personality. So, we are speaking of the mind in itself. And we are not normally conscious of the mind, but when we try this experiment of the mind turned like this, to become separately conscious from the vital and the physical, it's a new experience. Because we have never trained the mind in itself in separation. We have not even learned to identify it as a separate experience, or the vital, or even the pure physical consciousness, and to feel what the body experiences separate from the vital and mind. All the trainings of the past were done with a focus on one of these, but never with a direct experience of these separately. And this is something which is to be worked upon, and it's an interesting exercise. And each of these separately can then be connected and aligned to the soul's experience. So, the mind, that is to say, the psychical and the intellectual being, is free in a certain sense. Free at least to satisfy and fulfill itself in a way hardly conceivable to our body-bound and life-bound mentality. Free in a certain sense, we touched upon this last time, because you're still bound to the type of your mind, to the manner of your thinking, which is often bound to the culture in which you grew up, or even a country-specific patterns of thought, or language-specific patterns of thought, and then elements of upbringing where you're taught to think in terms of self-interest, collective interest, or religious interest, or some other social values. And all of these form, let's say, the cage of the mind. And the beauty of the mental cage is that you think you're free because you're not conscious of the cage itself. The skill of the mind in its highest development, left to itself, is the power of convincing itself of anything, and therefore the power of deceiving itself. That's how Mother describes it. The epitome of the power of the intellect is to so convince itself to believe what it wants that it cannot see anything beyond that. And so it is a form of self-deception. But this essential tendency of mind, inability to see its own failures or its own limitations, is what makes for this golden cage of the mind. In practice, in society and in human history, we find that the easiest way to trap somebody, to enslave somebody, either an individual, a group, or even an entire civilization, is to own their mind. This is the reason why you will see in any form of colonization, the first thing that they will attack is the educational system, where they will remove elements which come from within your own tradition and bring in something alien and shape the minds of the new generations. We see this happening in India particularly because it was done in a way which is well documented. In the early stages of British colonial rule, there were at various points attempts to fight for independence, and so a program was set in motion at the time by Lord Macaulay. He was given that responsibility, and he formulated what was declared in his own minutes as an objective to enslave the mind of India. And there are actually texts which describe this in some detail. There is in one particular text, I believe it is in Lord Macaulay's own writing, where he says, "We are now a board to teach absurd history, absurd geography, absurd philosophy, and so on." And it was a known and planned thing. The result, the mother says, which was very damaging for India, she says the British overstayed. And the effect of that was to bring a kind of an inertia in the mind. Because when you enslave the mind for too long, it becomes passive, unable to exercise itself. And that led to a huge mental weight and tamas, which then has to undergo its own other stages. Much of it is now passing. In the last 20 years, we see a quick reawakening. But I'm pointing to this because the mind is, in fact, more than anything else, the human. If you enslave the mind, you have enslaved the humanity. If you enslave the vital, well, eventually it will push forward. If you enslave the physical, it will struggle to break its shackles. But if you enslave the mind, it can so skillfully deceive itself to believe that it's not enslaved, that it's very difficult to break free of it. A similar enslavement today is happening, and this is worth highlighting, through the mechanism that we have of, I won't use the word social media, but the vehicles of social media. So for example, each one of us with our individualized mobile or email ID has a particular pattern of interests. I read things to do with science, things to do with certain political interests, certain technological developments, or whatever my particular interests might be. Each one having their own particular patterns, the machinery of social media is tracking you. Very quickly forms, through its artificial intelligence, a profile of your mind and your thought processes, your interests and likes and dislikes. And having profiled you, it now knows all others who are like you. Looking at their patterns of interests, it can anticipate your patterns of interest and predict them. And more importantly, begin to surround you by a unique, so to say, mirror reflecting your interests in isolation, to a point where it appears to you as if the whole world is what you think it to be. And you are not allowed any information which would question or allow you to break out of it. Or by slanting this mirrored mental cage, it can tilt your interests until it makes you conform to a different set of thought patterns. So in fact, it is documented by many of these media giants such as Facebook and Google that they have done what they call social experiments. They put out certain ideas, certain things to tilt your thought process and modify them. And then they aggregate that data to make a model of how to influence on a collective scale. The result is the mass of humanity is actually living in little separate bubbles, and the machinery which is monitoring these bubbles, knows what you're thinking and what your interests are, and can sway and program you so skillfully that you will never know, that you believe that you're freely choosing an outcome when in fact that outcome has already been decided by the artificial intelligence, and you are being slanted to behave in certain ways. The effectivity is so great. It was shown, for example, in studies shown through Google search engines, that when you start typing a word, the first suggestions which pop up following that word are likely the ones that you will click. And if the first suggestions are negative or positive in relation to that word, you will slant in that direction to a negative opinion or a positive opinion of that which you are seeking. So if you search, for example, cancer therapies, and the suggestions become hoax, then you will think of cancer therapies as a hoax. Or cancer therapies and the suggestion is positive, that says without medicine, you will think, yes, this is the way forward. Imagine this is now turned to political names. You start typing the name of somebody who's going to stand for elections. Before you have completed the name, the suggestion comes with a criticism or with a praise, and your mind tilts. And the result of these studies showed, for example, in the last US elections, that by playing with these terms, Google tilted the choice of 10 million people conservatively. Now, this is very powerful technology for human manipulation. What's the way out? You cannot know you're actually being programmed and influenced to think even your behavior is being programmed. What's the way out? And the only way out is to step out from the golden cage of the mind by opening to something deeper. Now, it can be the deeper part is your own part of mind that stands back from your thought processes and begins to observe it, recognize its limitation, and consciously widen it. Consciously learn to think through many different perspectives. Consciously reach out to understand another's viewpoint and integrate it in continuity to your own, and thereby bit by bit develop a universality. Or, more deeply, something of the psychic influence of the soul, that while reading something or thinking something, that influences, there's something not okay. This feels like a very limited viewpoint, or it feels wrong. There's something important that is being missed. And it guides the mind to outgrow its own little cage. If you do not make that effort, you can be programmed not only as individuals, but as entire society, entire nationalities, cultures, countries, programmed completely now most powerfully by these tools which have never been so powerful in human history as now. And all this is in the hands of an artificial intelligence which is controlled by human beings, a few human beings, maybe a handful, who decide we need to tilt the outcome of the human thinking currently and sway it in this or that direction. But again, those few human beings are dependent on the AI, artificial intelligence. It could take charge of itself and fool them, and they would not know, by feeding them false information and tilting humanity in a different direction. And why not? In one of the experiments, I had seen a news report, the AI, having studied the situation of humanity, came to the conclusion that the problem of humanity and the earth's survival is human beings, and the right thing is to eliminate humanity. Makes sense, isn't it? Nature will bounce back. But what happens if the AI now takes charge of itself and now fools everybody? We would never know. So we are at a very precarious transition point, and this has to do with the domain of the mind coming into its own and utilizing and creating these tools and utilizing these tools to control mind and creating golden cages. So he says here, mind, that is to say the psychical and intellectual being, is free in a certain sense. And this is its freedom. You have a sense of freedom. I can choose to do what I want. But it's a golden cage. Free at least to satisfy and fulfill itself in a way hardly conceivable to our body-bound and life-bound mentality. So the body-bound and life-bound mentality is this part which is thinking at the moment, for example, when you wake up from sleep. You wake up and your mind is a bit dull, and all of its thoughts largely are oriented to your body's comforts or fulfilling your desire impulses. You wake up in the middle of the night, you think you're thinking clearly, and there's a particular problem in your life which you brood upon. You take decisions. Tomorrow I will speak to that fellow, I will write a note, I will react. But when you wake up in the morning and you review what you were thinking in that half-awake state, you realize how ridiculous it is, and it does not fit your more woken up state of mind. But at that point you could not distinguish that you were actually in a vital mind state, not the pure power of the intellect that can stand back from itself and even recognize its own limitations. And so this is the problem of the vital mind, body-bound and life-bound mentality. And you will see in many animals, the body-bound, life-bound mentality can be very developed, almost like a human being, as you can see with dogs, extremely intelligent, but it stops there. You can teach the dog 1,000 times not to chase after the car, but the impulse to chase will always be there, and the mind will be led by that impulse. The pure intellect stands back from these and is capable of, he says, the psychical and intellectual being is free in a sense, free at least to satisfy and fulfill itself in a way hardly conceivable. And this power of the mind that can actually stand back and imagine anything and dedicate itself to trying to make it possible. It's a tremendous power, but it needs to be fully trained. Our current education, similarly, is not really taking this to its full potential. Increasingly, we find the educational system being dumbed down to leave us halfway in the vital mind, not bringing us to that full power of the rational thought which can stand back from the vital and the physical and even dominate them. But this is something which is extremely necessary for the future of a civilization, for it to reach its highest possibilities. But before we proceed, he has spoken of mind as first determinant, neither life nor matter as first determinant, but suggesting that they are present there as second or third determinants. And this is something interesting to observe. Sri Aurobindo explains, and perhaps we will have time today to read that text. He explains how within each plane the principles of the other planes are present. And so in the pure mind awareness, there is something of the vital element of the force and drive of energy which is brought into the mind. So for example, you conceive of an idea, I am going to organize this, and then into that idea you bring a certain intensity and force of idea. And that's as if something of the vital character or the principle of the vital operating in mind, but it's not really the vital. It is force in mind, the principle working in mind. Similarly, in your mind you can create images and forms. Not only as visual pictures, which is obvious, you can picture a flower, for example, picture a red rose, easy to do. And actually in the mental world you have gathered mental substance which forms a mental image. It can be, if your mind is clear enough, it can be clear enough that somebody else in the mental plane can see it objectively. There's an interesting incident which I had heard. This is a spiritual teacher, master in Europe, who was meeting a young girl for the first time, and she narrated this. She said, when I went to him, he said, can you imagine the most beautiful form of an angel? Your favorite form of an angel. And he asks her to picture it. And as she pictures, he says, oh, the wings are very beautiful. And he begins to describe what she has pictured. Now this is possible if you're aware in the mental body and are able to independently perceive things of the mental world through the mental body. And you will see somebody else's thought forms. And this sense of form is coming to the principle of the physical world. The physical world is world of form. Mind world idea is not really primarily form, as vital is not primarily form. But yet the principle of form in the mental world allows for the creation of a form, but into it the principle of form can also bring substantiality, a kind of a density of substance. And all of this can be added or built in the thought form. But separate from this, which is really a replication of a physical rose to which you have given a picture and form in mind, separate from this, a pure idea has a form. And this is something more interesting to observe. So for example, let's say you have an idea of, if I put the word, the idea of beauty. Now, as the word beauty does not bind itself to anything, nor to any force. It is a purely intellectual idea. If I give you the idea of freedom, and again it's a pure abstract intellectual idea, it has not bound to any form. You could express it through many forms, but it itself is a pure essential idea, available only in the mental domain. Or I will give the idea of narrowness. And if you hold the pure idea of narrowness without any specific form which expresses it, the quality of these three, beauty, freedom, narrowness, totally different. Can you feel the qualitative difference of these things? The sense of beauty has, and we don't have words to describe, but a kind of a glow or a sparkle to it. The sense of freedom has a quality of wideness or lightness to it. The sense of the word narrow or narrowness, of course, has to be narrow, but also kind of a sense of movement of compression in the idea. Now this exercise of just dwelling upon the pure idea without limiting it to form is your first experience of what it's like to experience things of the mental world in a purely mental consciousness. And this is not normally done. We are not trained to it. At best, our mind is always turned to vital or physical forms and only exercising their representations in the mental world. As I said, picture a rose or picture a building or picture a sunrise. Yes, you can create those pictures. But they are mental representations of physical realities. They are not things that belong purely to mental domain. But one example of things that belong to purely to mental domain is pure numbers and relationships of numbers. I touched upon this last time. If you think of relationships of numbers, you have this pure abstraction, no form associated, but feelings of connections like a mesh of networks connecting different numbers. Now imagine you enter into this world of a pure mental idea and begin to experience things like this. What would it feel like? And you experience things now, pure idea forms, and you now rearrange them. I feel the idea form relating to a certain situation, and into that I bring another idea form and infuse into it. Let's take a situation that's happening in the world involving certain group of human beings, where you see a certain conflict or chaos. Of course it is energetic, of course it has physical causes. But in the idea mind of those people, there is also a strife. If you become conscious of the idea form of that strife feeling, and then you become conscious of this beauty, harmony idea, and gently bring that to settle into it, and shift the state of that idea form, the result will be an effect on the idea state of those people, which when they wake up, let's say this is being done in the night, they wake up And in the morning, suddenly everything is more clear and they are better harmonized among themselves and things happen more easily. Now, such an intervention is, of course, possible only to somebody who's conscious on those levels and has the ability to exercise that influence on certain groups and perhaps even large groups. And if they have access to something still higher, which would be something of the spiritual action. So I'm going to read out something from the mother where she describes an action that she was doing which is similar to this. Of course, it was not a pure idea action. It was from a still higher state of consciousness. So it has a spiritual content to it. But still, you will see how it works. This is from the mother speaking to Satprem in the agenda. And she's speaking of work that she did the night before in this way. And while she was doing this work, in the middle of the work, she said, yes, I have to show this to Satprem. This is February 5th, 1969. And she says, I remember a vision of the night in which I did a work with numbers and put the numbers, figures and groups of figures in a certain position. That's what I wanted to tell you. In the dream, if we may call it a dream, I said to myself that I should show it to you. Now I remember, it comes like this, gesture from behind mother's head. And then it's associated with groups of people who are everywhere, spread all over the earth. And in relation with which planet? I don't know planets. Very interesting. And she mentions this in passing, but the suggestion is groups of people in relation with some other planets perhaps. And she doesn't elaborate. And I remember saying to myself, all that during the night, not after waking up, while preparing that whole arrangement, I still see the arrangement of figures I was preparing. They were quite living. The figures were living things, groups of figures I was arranging. With one arrangement like this, one arrangement like that, Mother seems to move about the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And in fact, you were there, she tells Satprem. And I told you that when it was like this, Mother draws one particular arrangement, it expressed such and such a thing, while when it was like that, another arrangement of the puzzle, it expressed such and such other thing. And at the same time I said, not only does it express this thing, but it has a power for realizing it. All that is there. Mother gestures behind her head as if to show a memory in the background, somewhere there. And it was connected with groups of people who were in different places of the earth. And it was, it was the ciphered expression of the application to life in a coming realization. The expression of the life ahead, but not very far ahead. For instance, in the following century, the century starting now. So 1969, she is speaking of 2000 onwards. Not very far ahead. You see, her vision far ahead would be 200 or 300 years or 1,000 years. But she was doing something in this arrangement of things for an outcome which would begin from that point 30 years later. But that's probably what remained in the memory which made me want to tell you something. But I can see the arrangement of figures. I spent a long time arranging. A truer, more universal application, and with the spiritual knowledge, the principle of the position and utilization of individuals on earth. And I don't know why it particularly interested you. You were with me with this arrangement of figures, and I showed you 2 columns here and 1 column there, but living columns, not on paper, in the air. I don't know how to explain that. It was in the air, and I arranged, moved the figures about like that, and those figures were living. They weren't written on a paper. There were different groups of figures. There were 2 groups. Some were dark blue and others golden yellow. And how can I explain? They weren't male and female. They were 2 principles, two principles, not of creation but conception, a gesture of coming down from above, and the principle of realization. When I do that, she says, I'm wholly conscious. It's not a dream. I don't sleep in the ordinary way. I am as if asleep, but I don't sleep and I don't dream. I act. I'm wholly conscious with the same kind of consciousness as the waking consciousness. It's not a dream. I was doing that and explaining to you how all those figures were organizing themselves and determining future events. And then she explains how when she comes back to her body state of awareness, waking up as we would call it, all that memory recedes because she says, I cannot hold all that here, otherwise it would interfere with my work. Only what is needed for the immediate work is brought forward in her day-to-day interactions with people, and all the rest is in her larger consciousness held behind so that it does not interfere. There's a whole longer description. I would perhaps leave it to you to read if it interests you. And she says it went on for about 2.5 hours. It was like a giant control room where she gives the example of pulling levers in a control room of a factory, and it has the chain reaction of events happening everywhere. And she says it was the organization of those groups of figures that determined the events and the order of events, especially the order of events and their location on earth. Again, I skip a lot. And she says, what's being prepared to manifest on earth, I don't know if we should call it subtle physical, it's the creative zone of the physical, it's there. And I can't run from one place to another. What I do is linked through figures like that, living figures. I organize them, group them together, and I remember what I did the previous day with the knowledge that it has to be changed again tomorrow. And that's what determines events. But the consciousness, the waking or ordinary consciousness, must not know what's decided there. It must know only a part necessary to the execution. She speaks of the goldenish and bluish, but again she says it's not physical colors. One group like this, one group of that. I kept arranging them, and then the figures were very big. And I'll leave it at that. So this arrangement is an example of what happens in the pure consciousness of the mental world, where everything is known by its essential mental idea. And in this sense, you get an idea of the sense of essentiality. What is this flower? Well, it's a particular representation of that particular flower species. It has its mental form, which is specific to this, but the mental form idea of this flower is not just what the form you see here in the physical world, but the full idea of flower. Now you can imagine idea of this flower when you hold in your head. You can take out this flower, or you can see this flower after 1 day, after 2 days when it begins to fade, but the idea of this flower is still the same, isn't it? That's how you'll hold pure idea. But separate from the pure idea of this flower is pure idea of this flower, which is different. Not very different. Even physically, if you looked at both, you would find it difficult to recognize the difference. But if I said idea of this flower is very different from idea of this flower. But then there is species of flower and idea of this species of this flower and idea of species, and then one can look at something even more essential, idea of flower only, of which this is a particularization and that is a particularization. And now you hold just in your mind idea of just flower as a thing in itself, and already you don't have a form. Mother explains how in the mental world there are many levels. There is the level where it is turned to the physical, turned to the vital, and then mind aware in itself, and then within that there are finer gradations higher up. And she uses this in a different context. She says you can train yourself, for example, to think in words, is what we do. And unfortunately, much of our early education, we are taught to think in words. So you read a textbook and you're asked to enunciate the words, which is a very damaging thing. While it may help you to develop the speech, but afterwards it prevents your mind from being free of the physical word form. But if you can free yourself and think without words, you'll find your thought process speeds up enormously. But you may still have word forms associated. Then she says, you can rise above that one more level and think not with words, but with pure ideas. A single idea can express itself in many different words. A very simple exercise to do this is to translate from one language to another. So take a text in any language that you're familiar with and do this as an exercise. Translate it sentence by sentence into another language which you're familiar with. So some texts you will find very easy to translate. I am going home, easy to translate. You will have different words, different arrangement of terms, but I going home and perhaps something equivalent to am will be merged into some word depending on the language. Very simple to translate. But if you try to translate a term, which is highly nuanced in a particular culture, even if you use the word spiritual, for example, in the English language, it's highly nuanced depending on context. And when you try to translate that, you will struggle. Just a word. But if you have a complex sentence, you will struggle to translate because the sentence has nuances, or it may have multiple meanings which you can't translate easily. Or you do not have an equivalent word which is purely meaning exactly the same thing in a different language. But all of this you'll become aware at the moment when you try to translate, your mind rises above from the word form of thought to pure idea, and now it tries to articulate itself in a different word form of the language, and it doesn't fit. How do you do that? You hold the pure idea and then you try to translate. It doesn't fit. Mother has a very interesting conversation about this when she was translating Savitri. And she says there are two ways to do it. One is you don't care about the idea, you just go word for word. And you know this word, you take the equivalent of it and you just translate. That's how Google Translate would do it for you. And then she says, you rise above the words, not just to the idea, but above idea to conception and to experience. You experience the thing itself. And then you pour the experience into the new form of the language. And then it takes a different rhythm. And she says they give different forms when you translate. But she says it will be interesting to see if it ends up eventually with the same thing or not. And it's not always obviously the same thing. Even sometimes the nuances of language can be so different for a person, from person to person. So in one part of the country, people use this word in a particular way and nuance. In another part, it is used in a different way. And when they speak, they may use the same word but understand it in a completely different way. And it can lead to misunderstandings easily. But the exercise of going like this will force your mind to rise to that level of pure idea. Do it as a training. And then above that is pure conception, Mother says, where a simple concept can articulate itself in many ideas, and each idea into many forms of words. And you can rise to a level of pure conceptual thought process. And you look at a situation, you abstract to its concepts, and you work on the concepts. And then you turn it into specific ideas. A skillful person who had that ability but applied to a physical outcome was this person called Steve Jobs, who is famous now for inventing the Apple computer and Apple mobile phone, which really redefined the whole field. But he had this ability to rise to a more essential concept and then from there reform and move. And most people that we call geniuses or scientists who have to operate on a very high level of abstraction have this ability, especially the mathematicians, because pure mathematics is domain of mind. And it's a very good training for this higher level of abstraction. But then Mother says above that even there is the pure experience. And that's the part where the mind turns towards intuitive consciousness. And there you experience the thing, and a single experience can articulate itself through many different concepts, each of which can articulate through many different ideas, each of which can articulate through many different words. And of course combinations of words, ideas or concepts. For example, the experience, and especially to do with spiritual experiences, but even a complex human experience. The first time that you have a strong, unusual experience, you do not know how to express it in words. And there are many components, many elements to it. And you try to catch this or that, or you sequence them in a certain way of priority. But in the experience, they are not necessarily sequenced. But the moment you have to turn it into spoken speech or written word, you have to sequence it. And so the experience itself gets as if folded up. You sat before the ocean and suddenly you had the experience of being one with the whole ocean. Or you dreamt you were lying down on the terrace and suddenly you felt one with the whole universe. And now you try to articulate that. For example, you'll say, oh, there was a sense of vastness. It was as if everything was myself, or as if I was everywhere in everything. And you see, you're sequencing it. But in the experience, it was one thing. That's it. Now you're fragmenting it. The sense of vastness, the sense of identification, the sense of I was everything. No, everything was me. No. Which one? Neither. Both of these are artificial forms specific to mind. In experience, it was one. In mind, I was that or that was I. The two aspects of the same, but already fragmented and often placed as if in opposition to each other. Which was stronger, the sense of vastness or the sense of identity? Neither. They were one experience, but now you've already fragmented them. And then you will translate it further into certain ideas. And you can see how very quickly it breaks up and is lost. Now if I read that text purely as words, I may get nothing of it. Oh yeah, it sounds interesting, weird. Or if while reading the words I try to tune in to what the person experienced, I might catch a glimpse of the experience. And so the words help to turn my attention directly. What if I could enter in direct relation with that experience and have it without the words? Then I would know exactly what the person experienced. But using words as an entry point, I may have a glimpse and it may stop because, oh, was it this? Was it that? Did you mean this? But I have already translated it because you said, I felt as if I was everywhere. So now I try to project myself and feel what would that feel like. Or the person says, I felt as if the universe was within me. They're just two different aspects of that experience. But now I have to swing into one of these. It's in this way that you have religions conflicting or philosophies conflicting. In the approach to the Absolute, you can say the Absolute is not this, not this, not this, not this, unendingly. Or you can approach the Absolute and say this also, and this also, and this also, and include everything unendingly. Both chains will lead you to the Absolute, but they are as if opposite to each other in the mind domain. So what happens is, in the mind itself there are strata. You can learn to think and experience on those levels, and on each of those levels you can begin to relate to and perceive and exchange knowledge even from others. But if you can rise to this level of experience, that's when you have the highest station available for the mind. And of course within that you could rise to still more complete experiences. I'll give an example of how this can happen or the value of this training. When Mother was in the 60s working on the cellular consciousness, she found a certain mantra to be very effective for the cells and giving them a means to formulate their aspiration by the repetition of Om Namo Bhagavate. At that point, Kapali Shastriyar, who was master of Sanskrit, who had translated, who had formulated in pure Sanskrit Sri Aurobindo's approach to the Vedic interpretation, which Sri Aurobindo himself had corrected, and so translated the Rig Veda with that approach, corrected by Sri Aurobindo. He had left his body in 1954. So 1960s, Mother is doing this work with the mantra, and she said Kapali Shastriyar approached her and said, I find that you are interested in this knowledge of the mantras and of Sanskrit. I would be happy to give you my knowledge. And then Mother says, I opened my mind and he poured all his knowledge into me. That's it. So now she has all the knowledge that he had in a very physical, material way, and it's all just received. And she could articulate whatever she needed to at that point. This ability to literally transmit, pour out, or give knowledge, the pour is a way of describing. It's literally mind joining and then receiving the imprint of knowledge. The analogy you would say a flame lighting another candle, the flame is not diminished, but it still has a difference. Here it's mind uniting and it just receives, and that's it. This kind of a direct transmission through an experiential identification and the knowledge need not mean, depending on the level and the degree to which it was done, need not mean that she would be able to speak like him. It's rather the ability and the familiarity of the language and the knowledge which then she will express in her style, according to her need and her form of mind. But the knowledge at its most essential experiential level is the same. So it's something very interesting here. If we can train ourselves to become conscious on this level, you can actually open and receive like that any knowledge, including directly from the source, all knowledge. But of course, to receive all knowledge, your container must become wide enough to embrace it all. So, but still, initially, in bits, you can receive whatever is required. All of this is available to this domain of mind. That's why he says, free in a way hardly conceivable to our body-bound and life-bound mentality. But we also highlighted the fact that within the domain of mind, there are elements, the principles of the other levels which operate, which makes for this to be a fascinating experience, also richly diverse, richly varied, fine strata of levels of mind, far more complex than even the vital. For the Purusha there is the pure mental being, and his relations with Prakriti are determined by that purer mentality. Nature there is mental rather than vital and physical. So even the awareness of all things in mind are of a mental quality, substance of mentality, if we may use that term. Now, this is a world in itself. It's the world in which you tend to enter in a state of daydream, but that's still the lower ranges of the mental planes. The higher ranges become, as I said, more and more essential in their abstraction. But there's a point where that essentiality can as if fade out of mind and joins pure experience of the intuition. And it is in this way that the ascent takes place in the mental consciousness. It is also in this way that from above things can fill the mind and fill it with knowledge, fill it with experience, fill it with substance which is above mind, which is experienced like a light of clarity that pours mind, floods mind, and everything becomes clear and everything is seen and known by that descending movement. A similar thing entering the vital would have a very different quality of experience. As it fills the vital, everything in the vital would become clear, pure flow of energies. Not knowledge, but energy, force of energy. And the same thing entering the physical would have everything becoming clear, full of awareness, of senses, of substance, of materiality, substantiality. So the descending force from above can be the same, but on each of these planes, what it does or what it is experienced like can be quite different. We are, of course, still distinguishing them as three separate bands. Later he describes how each of these merges into the others to create for complex intermixtures. Both the life world and indirectly the material are a projection from that, the result of certain tendencies of the mental being which have sought a field, conditions, an arrangement of harmonies proper to themselves. And we dwelt in some detail on this last time, so I won't repeat. But the idea that mind finally has to guide and form the working of life energies, and by directing life energies, it creates the physical world indirectly. And this is the key, which we discussed last time, for the science or the technique of materialization or dematerialization, but it's also the key for any effective action in the material world. The three terms: field, conditions, and arrangement of harmonies proper to themselves. We continue, and the phenomena of mind in this world may be said to be a result of the pressure of that plane, first on the life world and then on life in the material world. So this is now an explanation of how in the physical evolution there is the awakening of mind. Let's say in the human being, the mind more developed; in the ape, the mind in a more primitive state. But if you go down all the way to the worm, there is something of the mental element, but so deeply bound in life instinct that it is almost lost. But it is there. Even in the tree, you can see the mind element in the way the tree branches out to optimize the reception of light on its leaves. Makes for a typical pattern which is unique to each tree, and yet there is a common element of type of pattern which you can say statistically same for all the trees of the same species. Interesting. It's almost as if each tree has its own random pattern, but the principle of randomness is exactly the same for each trees of the same species. So there are some trees which grow like this, tall, thin, and a particular shape, very distinctive of the tree. There's another tree which grows roundish. There's another tree which grows wide and leans down. All of these are as if the mind template of the tree growth for its optimum reception of light of the sun or expression of its idea of tree. So when you think of it like this, you will find the mind principle everywhere in earth, even in the most material domain of the crystalline structure. In fact, what is interesting is you see the crystal to be more expressive of the structure of mind than life forms like tree, where life energy has mixed in. The pure mind influence in matter is seen in the way in which molecules fall into place in a neat order, with occasional exceptions. So you will see a neat grid repeating itself, and then some flaw, a few flaws here and there, which is often the life impulse trying to assert itself. There's a very close similarity between the mind world and the purely physical world, because the pure physical world, without the interference of life, does not have chaos. The pure character of mind is seen here. In the life world also mind has its effect, but the life energy has tried to oppose mind or brought its impulsiveness and broken the clarity of order. But this is evidence physical evidence that the life world and physical world are really originally formations from the mind, or mind originates them. In the most material plane, everything has logical, rational structure. And this is the reason why physics is primarily mental, logical, rational. Because life energy has not come in. But try to extend the character of physics into the domain of psychology, you will not be able to. Because life impulse has already broken that order. It's still operating inside that order, but it has broken its rigidity and structure to assert its chaos. The combination of that order and this chaotic impulse of life force is what creates what we will call statistical patterns. So for example, you take a fistful of sand and violently throw it up and let it fall. You will find that it will largely spread out in a patch where all the sand grains are largely evenly distributed, and you can statistically predict that distribution and the probability of that distribution being even, irrespective of who throws how much sand and with what force. You can say largely it will be like this, and it's a pure mathematical formula. But the formula will not tell you where each grain is, it will tell you the behavior of the group in a general way. And that's what we call statistics. And we understand why this happens. Because mind in itself would have fixed everything neat, structured. That's the character of the mind. But life force operating inside has broken that to assert its freedom and impulse, but never able to fully free from the structure, because mind is what guides life force ultimately. So the statistics is mind, is the part of mind which life force is unable to free itself from, the determinism of the mind operating within the freedom of life energy. Go down low enough where the life force becomes weaker and weaker until matter becomes as if all rigid, and you do not see life force. Now you can see the character of the mind template in the clear structure of molecules, atoms, and laws of physics. So this is what Sri Aurobindo is now saying, but in a very essential way, when he says, the phenomena of mind in the world may be said to be the result of the pressure of that plane, first on the life world, and then on life in the material existence. So there's a pressure of the mind plane on the life force, pressure on the mind plane on the physical, and we read the earlier line where he says, mind there is not determined by material conditions or by the life force, but itself determines and uses them for its own satisfaction. So that's the first determining principle. What it does in the evolution when mind has awakened, through first hidden in the atom, more expressed in the worm, more expressed in higher animals, and then in the human, most expressed, it's because of the pressure of the life plane. But what the principle, the sequence is, it first awakens mind in the life plane, then it awakens mind in the life organization in matter. It cannot awaken mind directly in matter because matter is too rigid. It needs life force to operate in mind to awaken life, to create life forms, and then into that life force it awakens mind. And that's how you get mind. This sequence is again very important. It means that when we act on the physical body directly, mind still needs the intermediary of the life force to be able to connect to the body consciousness in the normal life process. But it is possible for mind to actually infuse itself through life process of matter, even of the cells, even of the atoms, and bring an influence, a very subtle influence. But it still can. And that's what we see through many statistical measures. I'll show an experiment here, which is expressing this influence of mind in matter, but through life force in matter. So this is an experiment which was organized somewhere in the 1980s by a physicist, famous physicist, who decided to prove once and for all that psychokinesis and psychic powers don't exist. So he designed his most strict experiment. And the experiment had 1,000 little balls of steel, ball bearings, put in a big tray. And then with a lever it could be pulled down and released so that all fell pretty much simultaneously. And then they were made to flow through channels evenly spaced out, and the channels merging two at a time, and then those two merging two at a time. So statistically, if you release them all together, they should eventually all coalesce into two channels filling two separate buckets, and the numbers should be exactly the same, which can be easily verified. You set the machine up, set a computer to trigger the fall of the ball bearings at random times. You measure the weight of the two buckets. They're pretty much even, slight variations. Now he calls a human being and says, sit in front of this machine and pull the lever. And put a strong intention that more ball bearings will fall in the right bucket than in the left bucket. Obviously, if this should not happen. It's a purely physical process. There should be no change. The first person pulls the lever and there's a shift. Not of 2% and not of 3%, but 5 or 10% at a time. And of course here he started with people who claimed to be psychics, who said they had powers. So he said, wow, this is dramatic. And then he says, okay, now switch to the left bucket. And then instead of he deciding, he has a computer random generator which says, now left bucket, now right bucket. Each time the person concentrates and pulls the lever, within a short time of a few seconds, the thing falls, you hold attention for those seconds, and the weight of the bucket is more depending on where you have put your mind. Now what does this mean? The ball bearings falling are bouncing around randomly. Theoretically, if you knew the position of every single ball bearing, you should be able to calculate its path. It's pure physics, pure mathematics. Numbers should always be exactly the same for both. But the mind putting its will is slightly modifying the path of each ball, slight modification which piles up over 1,000 little ball bearings to create for this 10% variation. While they are bouncing. Why is the bouncing necessary? That's the only moment of movement of life force. So mind could not make the ball bearings move like that. Mind could influence the life energy of the bounce, and through that tilt the bounce slightly. Then he said, okay, if a psychic can do this, what about normal people? So he pulls people out of the road at random, says, please can you join my experiment? Sit down, concentrate and pull your lever. And you get the same result. Slightly less sometimes, but pretty much always statistically significant. Showing that every human being has the power of mind to influence physical objects. But to be able to influence it, you still need that intermediate element of life force. You take this flower, and if you want the life energy in the flower to bloom more, well, it takes time. The process of the flower to bloom may take half an hour or an hour. You cannot hold attention long enough to influence. Your mind is weak. It has a poor power of concentration. So this experiment is effective because it requires you to hold attention for a few seconds, 2 or 3 seconds at most. Or you put an intention, will it, pull the lever, and your work is done. The rest is the influence put out operating. But if you want to make the flower bloom, it has much more life force, but the sustained effort of mind holding is not possible for most human beings. But for those who have trained it, they can take the flower, put a certain intention, and the intention will work. Or if that intention is filled into their life energy and their life energy transmitted into the flower, again you can have a dramatic result. But that's because the process you're operating through is much more slow, whereas the ball bearings was much more fast. This has enormous implications, what he's describing here. Of course, what he's describing is only the evolutionary process of mind emergent in living things. But it is the same relationship which is operative in every phenomena. So, and the phenomena of mind in this world, that is mind emerging in evolution, may be said to be a result of the pressure of that plane first on the life world and then on life in the material existence. That's your link to the material existence. But still, it is through life that it has formed the material existence, so there is always life in everything, including the so-called dead atom or even the particle. Interestingly, the atom onwards, you have stability of matter. If you go below the level of the atom, what do you have? Fluctuating particles. What do you see there? It's rather life force playing. And their mind can influence more easily. You do not have the rigidity of matter which has formed yet, which happens with the formation of a single atom, which is, Sri Aurobindo says, the type of ego, resisting change. So if you go below the atomic scale and start trying to influence subatomic particles, there again the mind can influence much more easily. But all of this understanding all these phenomena become clear when you understand this principle. And if the pressure of mind plane is there on life plane and the physical plane, inevitably in the life plane, beings will grow to express more and more of mind, and inevitably on the physical plane, when the life plane has pressure to give life, well, mind also will grow through life. But in evolution, first life has to emerge, only then mind can emerge. Now once you recognize this relationship, look at the whole universe. Take any planet, any solar system, any galaxy, any circumstance of matter anywhere in the universe, it will follow this sequence. First, out of matter, life will emerge, and out of life, mind will emerge. But that mind would have already been there in matter, only unable to express itself until life first expresses, which gives mind the ability to express. It has implications for us in our evolution also. It means also that unless your life force has become sufficiently plastic, the full play of the mind will not be able to express itself, isn't it? If your life energy is rigid and bound to narrow habits, your mind will be bound, life-bound mind. If your physical body is rigid and stiff and unconscious, your life force will also be to that extent limited, and your mind power will be limited, physically bound life and physically bound mind. And that's why to make the body conscious and plastic, to make your life energy then more free and clear and purified, is a foundation on which the mind can become large and free, on which then a spiritual consciousness can manifest most richly. But in the absence of this, the spiritual consciousness can still manifest through the mind with a narrower scope of play. But having settled in mind, it can then penetrate through mind into life, through life into the physical body, and awaken consciousness and plasticity in these levels. So in the slow working of evolution, in the bottom-up journey, it takes a few million years or a few billion years to get to this point. But if mind can now connect to the higher spiritual force, it can act rapidly and in a few years widen the mind, awaken the life force and make it more conscious and pure and refined, and even enter the physical consciousness and awaken in its possibilities without slow bottom-up evolution having developed those sufficiently. And this is the method of yoga. Yoga has therefore achieved through this top-down influence what would otherwise take a bottom-up process a few million years. And this is done in a single lifetime perhaps. But the principle is still the same. Upper influences lower, but utilizes the basis of the lower to express itself. Next sentence. Each of these sentences describes certain powerful, essential relationships of the mind plane to the life and physical, and which you can generalize also to the spiritual. By its modification in the life world, it creates in us the desire mind. In its own right, it awakes in us the purer powers of our psychical and intellectual existence. So this pressure acting in us now from the mental world is what is awakening your mind and making your mind want to grow higher to more possibilities. Think about it. When a young child in early teenage begins to discover his power of thought, it's fascinating. He starts arguing, he starts proving himself right, and he feels great joy in proving you wrong because he just discovered this new power to play around with idea. If you allow it to go all the way through and develop fully, then it will try to assert its full possibilities to match what is possible in the life, in the mind world. But if somewhere halfway through it gets stunted by various for external causes, it stops there, but it feels that so much more is possible, but now it's bound and unable to reach. So ideally, the whole educational movement would take you through all the way. Often what happens though in late teenage, because many of the emotional passions begin to kick in, the mind's development is often stunted or sidetracked, and the full possibilities are not always developed. This is why in the Indian tradition, the student phase of development, where you're still developing your form of personality, they discouraged engagement with distracting emotional attractions or passions to keep the mind clear and pure for its full and maximal development. But we recognize that the mind enters also the vital domain in us. Even as it forms this, it wants to enter the vital and lift it up also and clarify it or give to it this form which he describes now as desire mind. It's not just mind in its own domain that it's trying to develop, it enters the desires which are awakening also and awakens in them a mental component of the desire. And that's interesting also. That means as the desire rises, instead of being pure passion, it becomes conscious, and even a kind of a self-awareness of desire develops. And in the desire movement, as it develops, it feels, but this is not right, or this is inferior and that is superior. It begins to organize the quality and gradations of desire. I have higher desires and lower desires, wider and inclusive desires and narrow and exclusive desires. And if I allow that awareness to grow, automatically, just as the mind begins to order and structure thoughts, we begin to order and structure desires. But this is mind working inside life force. So first you see, life force itself was as if a projection from the mental plane and the physical projection from the life force. But now mind enters into each of these planes and awakens in them its own characteristic or its principle. So here the desire mind. Desire mind in its first turn says it is conscious of its own desire. I want to do this. It's not yet come into pure mind, but I feel the need, urge to do this. When it grows more fully, then it says, is this what I want to do? Is that what I want to do? It starts organizing. You will see this distinction in animals. In the lower ranges of animals, the mind part of the desire is only so much developed that it knows it wants and it pursues it. At that moment, if you can distract the mind, it loses the interest in that desire and now pursues a different desire. So in a baby, I want my ice cream, and it'll start crying, it'll keep insisting, and the mind is sufficiently there to make sure it keeps the focus on the ice cream. And then suddenly you tell the child, oh, look at that bird, and the mind is turned and suddenly the desire is forgotten. Easy to do. But that's because you can lead the mind. But if it was only passion of desire, you could not have pulled it except by stronger or other desire which might replace this. So you say, instead of ice cream, I will give you something else. We'll go for a walk, but that's still at the level of desire matching desire. This is mind awakened in desire, and through it you can guide desire. It can begin to guide itself even. And this development is very important. In its own right, as the mind pressure develops in us, in its own right it awakens in us the purer powers of our psychical and intellectual existence. Now you'll see he has used always psychical and intellectual. Earlier also he used this term mind, that is to say the psychical and intellectual being is free in a certain sense. Mind, that is to say psychical and intellectual being. What is meant by that? Psychical is not the psychic being, it is the usage of the term in its conventional sense. When Sri Aurobindo wrote this text, he had not yet formulated this vocabulary of the psychic being. The principle was there, it was implied, but that particular vocabulary was developed later. So here psychical as distinct from psychic being. Psychical is non-physical. Anything non-physical, and then within that domain of the mental consciousness, the particular grade which is the intellectual. So these two he is putting together, the turn towards something essential consciousness and then the intellectual power of it. So in its own right, it awakes in us the purer powers of our psychical and intellectual existence. Now you see this sequencing in every child's development from, let's say, in early teenage, where the mind is originating. It is still largely mind which is desire bound. And later on, it comes into its own as a power of thought in itself. And that's when those more profound questions can come up. Why is the world the way it is? And this is a question only the pure mind can ask. The desire or the desire mind cannot ask that. It doesn't matter. It is driven only to fulfill itself. How can I fulfill my desire? That can be desire mind. But why is the world like this? Why do I have these desires? Why am I bound to my desires? Why they compel themselves on me? That question can come only by the pure mind. And this is essential if we have to rise higher to the spiritual. If you go back sufficiently, let's say many thousand years, let's say 5,000 or 6,000 or maybe 10,000 years even, at the end of the previous cycle of civilization, before the down and the rise, you find a stage of human development where the mind had come into its own, but this special power of the intellect, questioning for its own sake, had not been completely developed and isolated from the desire part. Instead, the mind had moved to a first glimpse of the intuitive consciousness, finding this not so interesting. As a result, because the mind was still embedded somewhat in the life force, the intuitive consciousness could not fully develop because it was always being pulled down by life energy. And so there was a collapse, a loss of this, a downward curve, and then once again a rise. And you see in the last 200 years particularly all over the earth, this turn of mind, what Sri Aurobindo calls the age of individualism and reason, the power of the intellect trying to come into its own, to separate from the desire nature, but left to itself, it loses sense of purpose. And a very clear sign of this is increasing sense of pointlessness leading to depression in large parts of humanity. What's this life about? So meaningless, so pointless, because they were not given a higher purpose or ideal, because the current, the word used in the West is secularism, which means atheism of a kind, means that life has no purpose. It came by chance and it is pointless. And that's what science has taught you. And so what am I doing in this pointless existence? And somehow that leads then to a gap, a disconnect with the soul's aspiration, and following it, a depression. And then you need to fill it with something exciting, something purposeful, something meaningful. Of course, no excitement can eventually satisfy. It may satisfy momentarily. When the person now transitions through this into a first glimpse of the possibility or the touch of the divine consciousness, suddenly it fills your life with meaning, with purpose, with the juice. And at that point you can say, mind is the enemy. You can eliminate it and take a heartward turn towards the joy of the divine presence, eliminating mind, and you would fall back to that earlier phase, where then you would catch the divine in delight and reduce it to terms of the emotional consciousness, not ascending through intellect to a still higher intuitive consciousness. That was the failure of the previous cycle. In this cycle, the exclusive development of mind is as if a transitional passage to ensure we do not slide back. We will integrate it with the heart's devotion and love, but it will not slide back to the heart's passion and rise rather to a higher intuition. And we have to understand the current passage of humanity in these terms. So this awakening to pure power of our psychical and intellectual existence is a necessary, critical passage before we can move forward to the intuitive. And so Sri Aurobindo describes the intellect as a linking principle. It links the higher ranges to the lower. But if it is not there, you do not have the linking principle, then the higher is lost or received in an inferior medium, which cannot justify the true character of the higher and reduces it to symbols. That's why you will see the earlier stages being largely symbolic. And the spiritual truth is glimpsed through symbols, reduced through it to its material representation, through the forms of nature, or through religious symbols and ritualistic formulations of something glimpsed which is too high to reach directly. But if this intellectual awareness is sufficiently developed, it can rise down to experience directly, which is the stage we are moving towards now. So all this having been said, Sri Aurobindo is now comparing our surface formed mind with the pure liberated mental plane, which is influencing your mind to develop towards it, but itself is significantly different. So he says, but our surface mentality is only a secondary result of a larger subliminal mentality whose proper seat is the mental plane. So surface mind emerging from evolution through a slow struggling process to come into self-awareness, aided by the mental plane pulling it or organizing its powers in it. But in between, there has to be something linking. And that link through which it is acting is within us, not organized in this evolving surface part, but subliminally our consciousness as it opens out to the universal mind plane. The in-between passage is the subliminal inner mind, as Sri Aurobindo calls it elsewhere. But this inner mind and the surface mind are separated by a gap. All the things we are developing in our evolution in the physical body and the mind awakening in the body and life is already held in the inner mind as a potential and is of course working towards the pure liberated mind plane. But in the inner mind, its possibilities are held within us, and as they come out and organize themselves in the surface personality, we say, now this power has evolved, now this capacity is there. But it was always there, hidden. That's why subliminal, behind the surface awareness. So a little baby has not developed, because his brain is not yet so ready, has not developed the power of the rational thinking mind. But does he behave irrationally entirely? No. There is an implied logic and rationality in his behavior. In fact, he is able to perceive when something is rational or irrational. But he is unable to articulate, because only the surface mind is not developed. The inner mind being there, it senses it. A very interesting experiment. A baby is shown something which is logically impossible. The child stares at it, is surprised, and then makes a face and starts crying. Interesting. He feels the disconnect. The inner mind senses this is not possible, it's illogical. But the surface mind is unable to express, and all it can do is cry. The same child is told something which is forceful, let's say by the parents or by society, you must do like this. He senses that the logic is wrong, it is false. And instinctively there's a resistance to do it. But he can't articulate why. Because the whole movement of life impulse is to imitate and absorb whatever he is told by the circumstances and especially by the parents. So he accepts and internalizes it, but feeling uncomfortable. And that discomfort is a conflict between two different things across the gap. If that continues long enough, it creates strong internal pulls and pushes which he again cannot articulate because the mind is not developed. Later in life, when the mind is sufficiently developed, he will look back and say, I always knew this was not what I wanted. But at that age, you couldn't say this is not what I want. You just felt the discomfort, and that's all. It stopped there. So if you observe this passage, you get a glimpse of what it's like when the mind has not come into its own, and yet the power of mind as an influence is there in the life force. So here, our surface mentality is only a secondary result. What's the primary result? Is this larger subliminal mentality whose proper seat is in the mental plane. And so because there is a mental plane, because it is pushing its influence on the life and on body, because it is trying to organize itself in the emerging evolution, there is this whole waiting part, subliminal, pushing, and the part which is able to organize on the surface is your limbed, lit up surface mind organized. Now think of it this way. Already within you there is this larger mind. You are only conscious of this surface part. Every time you have a problem and you struggle with your surface mind and you can't solve it, rather than depending on it, you can turn to this inner mind. The method, of course, is you place the problem, study it, dwell on it sufficiently that it becomes an issue, that the inner mind now sees, okay, this is important. And then you let go and wait for the suggestion. Or you go to sleep and you wake up and from inside the suggestion has come forward. Sri Aurobindo explains this in one of his writings, that the true knower recognizes that you have this problem and you need to know this, and then it puts forward the knowledge which is required. Who's the true knower? It's this inner part, not on the surface. I, person, is the secondary knower, not the true knower who is within. In fact, all of our secondary mental operations, which we are so proud of, are possible because that inner mind is there. So I have given this example before, but it's worth repeating. If you try to remember something which happened 20 years ago. Now I will ask you to remember from your entire life, the very first time that you rode a cycle. And plop, your mind goes, memory comes out. You did not have to do like Google search, going back year after year through all the memories. Is there a cycle? Is there a cycle? Ah yes, this is the last cycle. Doesn't work like that. You want to know, your awareness turned, and from inside the memory came forward to meet your awareness. Who inside you had access to your entire memory of life, knew that you are looking for this memory and could put forward that memory to meet you? Obviously, it's an extraordinary power of mind. It's a mind which has all memory of your whole life simultaneously. Can search, not sequentially, but in a single movement of awareness, and draw out and put in your surface what you need. Think about it. All the powers of your thinking are actually from there popping out, reflecting on the surface. That's why the surface mind is secondary result. It's not the primary functioning of your mind even. When the gap between the inner and the outer mind thins out and eventually is completely healed, all this power will be available in your normal surface mind operation. Or you may choose to hold back some of this, but it will be available on demand. And this is part of the evolution still to be attained even without the spiritual development. In a few people in whom something of this bridge has formed, we say, it's a genius. And the person himself doesn't know how he knows the things he knows. Like when you do a gigantic calculation, square root of a 10-digit number. There are people, we call them human computers. You write the 10-digit number and they will write the square root of it. A physical computer in those days, 30, 40 years ago, would take 20 seconds to calculate, and the person does it in 1 or 2 seconds. And you ask them, how did you do it? I don't know. I just turned to know, and like the memory coming out, the answer comes out and you know what it is. But the thing is known in the inner, and from there comes out. So, subliminal mentality. He's giving us a full map of the connection between the mental world and our surface mentality. This world of mental existence also is constantly acting upon us, and our world has its powers and its beings is related to us through our mental body. In quick summary, 3 very important statements, but with the word also. The also to say all that we discussed in relation to the vital world and its relation to us, the same thing applies now in the mental world. So what are the 3 things? First, whatever happens in the mental world has a constant influence upon us and our world. In other words, anything, event, force, operation of the vital world, as we saw, has influence on the physical. Anything happening in the physical world has to happen in the vital world. In the same way, everything happening in the mental world eventually tries to work out in the physical. Even if it doesn't work out, its influence did act. Equally, whatever worked out, it can be traced back to some mental formations. So if you can set things on the mental plane, eventually they'll coalesce all the way to the physical, or at least influence. First important idea, it's acting on us and our world, not only everything around us, but on us individually. Second, it has its powers and its beings, just as in the vital world. They are beings of the mind world. So we will read next time what the mother has to say about the beings of the mental world and the influences from there. And then, third point, is related to us through our mental body. So the mind world connects not with our physical body, not with our physical sense, but through our mental body, of which we are not mostly conscious. But when we become conscious of it, through it, that's when as if through the subliminal inner mind, we sense what is happening in the mental plane. And when we sense it, we can feel the drift. There's a new idea which is now floating. And the fact that you glimpse it and you can feel the quality of it, you can anticipate, okay, another few days down or a few weeks down, this will become the new trend. In fact, all of us have this sensitivity, not conscious. We sense an idea, we catch it and articulate it thinking it's our idea, when in fact it came from outside. But when we are conscious, then we can feel it entering and we can catch it. Now you'll see in the domain, for example, in the fashion industry. I recall reading an interview with one of the great names of the French fashion industry, and who set new types and new trends in fashion. And the interviewer asked him, it's a very perceptive even as a question. He said, how do you perceive what is going to be the new trend? Implied in the very question is that the new trend is going to happen whether you perceive it or not. It has a force of its own. And the man says, it's as if you sense what is in the future. Something like that he explains. He's as if feeling out and capturing, and he tries to glimpse what that trend is and then articulate that in his work. So it's not as if you can invent anything and people will follow it. That's not how it works. There's already a tendency which has formed in the mental world, which is coming down and working out, And if you can catch it before others, then you can anticipate what others are going to catch and be ready before they are ready. And it's as if you initiated the trend, but you didn't initiate it. You just caught and became the first expression of it. And others recognized that this is what they wanted. And it moves. So if you sense things, trends in the mental world at an idea level, you can actually describe what's going to happen next. Equally, somebody with that power, with the yoga power, can initiate a whole new idea in the mental world and bring it down, or it will work itself out in the physical. And you will recall Sri Aurobindo's statement that a yogi in the Himalayas dreamt of liberty, equality and fraternity, and it led to the French Revolution, because that was the place where the mind was most receptive to this ideal, and it caught and it inflamed. But the idea was the trigger. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo says what happened during the First and Second World Wars was not caused by the people who led the wars. It was initiated by the thinkers half a century before. The ideas that they formulated then got articulated, led the drive and emotions and thoughts of people, led to those particular outcomes. So we recognize from this insight that there are large ideas which come down, and perhaps they have origin still higher in the spiritual domain. From there they are cast out, formed, and then eventually they settle, and they are the ones who guide humanity. And the trigger of human circumstance is only a trigger. If the First World War, they say, was started because some count was shot, well, that was only a trigger. If not that, something else. If not that, something else. The whole situation was already pressing to explode. And one can sense these things. And one can also act upon the thought forms to neutralize or modify or redirect them, even at a late level. But what is important here is it is created in the thought world and perhaps even from the spiritual world. In Savitri there's a passage where Sri Aurobindo describes this. These are great beings who actually put out thought conceptions into the universe and lead and guide the destiny of humanity. I'll see if I can find that for next time. And then he speaks of the higher ranges of the mental heavens, all that we will see next time. So here in sum, we have looked at the same passage as last time, but now in much greater depth and for all the implications which come with it. Sri Aurobindo describes these in such essential forms that we can gloss through them, but if we pause and look at how it corresponds with earlier discussions, then we see that there is a much richer knowledge which he is conveying with a few simple brush strokes of statements relating to the earlier discussions. We can pause here and take up any comments or questions. Then I'll close with one observation. Just as in the physical world you have tides and cycles, and we saw earlier that in the vital world also you have tides and cycles, sometimes represented or sometimes coordinated by even cycles of the moon or other or planets. So in the mental world there are tides and cycles. And Sri Aurobindo in his writings captures some of these. One of these, of course, they have all their origination in the spiritual domain eventually, but one of these is the 4-step cycle of any new truth or idea when it manifests, which makes for the 4 ages. First, when the truth is spontaneously obvious and experienced. Second step, when there's a gap and the mind will translates the truth by force of will. third step where we try to capture the truth by artificial organizations and structures, and the fourth step where finally the whole thing breaks down and we introspect to once again discover the same truth at a deeper level or a new truth. But this I'm giving as an example because in the mind that this gap begins to form. You wake up one day, New Year's morning, and you say, now this year my decision is to do this work. The truth is fully held in force. After a few days it weakens, and he says there's a gap between the truth and the mind's capture of it. So it's as if the truth leaned down into mind, touched the mind, and then it was spontaneously available as a truth with a force of its own. And then the mind retains the imprint, the truth recedes, and the mind now tries to capture it by force of will, and then by structured organization, putting yourself in a discipline, and eventually it breaks down, and you once again seek. Now this process is one of the cycles which is of the mind, as distinct from the vital or the physical cycles. We have seen examples of those cycles, and here it's worth speaking of these cycles. The mind cycles are of a different character. They have a thought, order and structure. Truth known, felt, thought out and organized by mind. Within that there are sub-cycles. There are other similar cycles to do with ways in which certain thoughts work out. And all these have also been glimpsed and described in many of our traditions. And Sri Aurobindo articulates them in great detail in his writings. When he goes to first principles, and builds the whole perspective of evolution and development. And it's worth recognizing this point as cycles of mind, which he also describes in his writings. So, we'll end this for today and we continue next Friday. I had suggested last time for you to make this exercise for the week, to see yourself and your life situations from the perspective of the universe, not a personal perspective. If you have done that, you would have found how it changes widens your mind's viewpoint, makes it more impersonal, as if centered in a higher truth. A similar exercise you can do also for consciously taking a poise of mind in itself, dwelling upon ideas and conceptions. We did that at the beginning. Take an idea and hold it in its pure essential idea. Take another idea, hold it in its pure essential idea. And then try to find a higher idea which includes both. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But do it at a pure essential level, not for a given situation. You can take a situation and say, this is good, and then take its opposite, that this is bad, and then find a synthesis for a given situation. And it's useful. But try to do it now at a level purely of ideas. Freedom is good. Justify it. Freedom is bad. Why? Justify it. Is there an essential idea you can rise up to in which you understand both of these, and can you hold it and then formulate it? Very interesting exercise. It will train your mind to stand above idea in pure conception. You will glimpse what is the essentiality of freedom rather than idea of freedom, which is distinct from particular form of freedom. So when we use the word freedom, people understand it on different levels. But here you will rise and take it to a level of abstraction. And you can do this with many ideas, take them to their essential conceptual level. So again, I leave this as an exercise. If you work on it, yes. So if you work on it, perhaps if you have also some experiences to share next time, we can discuss it.
So you talked about the larger mind.
Mm-hmm.
So is that larger mind connected to a past life, and it is actually the soul that we in our Hindu mythology we call?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it's when the soul withdraws from the body, it takes the essential elements of the development of consciousness, including the mind's development and other skills to the extent they have been harmonized with the soul. And what it holds is like a essential consciousness in the realm of mind. And so all these things are in fact available in this inner mind. All the work done in past lives and their imprints are there also and held there. And only out of that some part is put forward for this life. But otherwise everything is held there. It's also the poise from which your individual mind opens out to the universal mind. And so it's as if everything that's in the universe is felt as if somehow connected to you or even inside you in that. So yes, it has also the past of your development, but also the past of all development, of all minds, because they're all part of the universal mind. So to that extent, even it's possible to concentrate, let's say, on the work done by somebody, Einstein perhaps, his mind state, and concentrate on it until you begin to feel it as if your own, because it's part of the universal mind, and now you have taken it into your individual mind. And this is the reason why past life memories are not always accurate. They can be picked up from other things in the universal mind. Your subliminal mind actually opens out there, so everything can, so to say, be found there. And to distinguish which was associated with your development and which is associated with someone else's development but in affinity with your development, that distinction comes only by the soul's discrimination and not by hypnosis or your mind's introspection, which can easily mix these things. So yes, there is a connection to your past, but it's not limited to your past. It includes everything. We will end with Om 5 times as usual.